What's up, fam? So let's do some Hebrew Israelite apologetics. So my man here is saying, what is a house of bondage? So this is in reference to Deuteronomy 28 and 68. Let's take a look at it. All right, so here it is in the King James Version, which is their preferred version, speaking of Hebrew Israelites. And it says, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." So Hebrew Israelites like to believe that this verse is speaking prophetically of the transatlantic slave trade. I'm going to demonstrate evidence to you that that is absolutely incompatible with what the scripture is saying here. He is believing that Egypt there is speaking metaphorically of a house of bondage. Let me show you the proof. So you can see from this reference, they're trying to insinuate that Egypt means a house of bondage, or that it means something other than the actual literal place. But notice that he quotes it, or he brings it up from a lexicon, which is a Greek lexicon. Let me show you what it shows in a Hebrew lexicon, because the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, not Greek. Check it out. So here are two different Hebrew lexicons quoted directly from Egypt in Deuteronomy 28 and 68. And you can see here that it is always talking about the actual geographic location of Egypt. It is not speaking metaphorically. There's only one time in scripture, which is in the book of Revelations, where Egypt is spoken of metaphorically, and the scripture tells you there that it's speaking of metaphorically. So what they're doing is the Hebrew hopscotch, which I told you is that they will take something from way in a scripture somewhere else that means something completely different and try to insert it into this particular reference when that is not what the scripture is actually implying. And I'm going to demonstrate that with actual evidence. So note, for the record, this is Strong's number H4714, which is directly tied to what Egypt is here, H4714. Now we're going to demonstrate evidence that this was literally fulfilled multiple times by the actual Israelites, not black Hebrew Israelites, but actual Israelites. And we're going to do so showing you the sources. Let's go. So let's look at a couple of sources. This one here says the accomplishment of this prediction took place under Titus when, according to Josephus, multitudes of Jews were transported in ships to the land of the Nile and sold as slaves. Let's go to that quote by Josephus. Boom, here we go. See what he says. Few thousands of Jews went into Egypt and Phoenicia because of the sedition in Syria after the death of Alexander, and where it seems in the process of time they became slaves. You can see the source there. Here's another one. Now when Jerusalem was taken by Titus, those above 17 years of age were sent by him to the works or mines in Egypt. So that's two quotes that shows that this was literally fulfilled. Every single time this is pointed out to Hebrew Israelites, they're mute. They never interact with these sources because they know that if we can show that this was literally fulfilled in history, it absolutely debunks their claims that this is talking about prophetically the transatlantic slave trade. So are we to believe that we should disregard these literal fulfillments of being taken back to Egypt in ships in light of a prophetic fulfillment of taking to a prophetic or metaphorical Egypt? That doesn't make it. I love this particular commentary because it points out how everything in Deuteronomy 28 is a reversal of what God had done, the previous blessings that God had lavished upon Israel. That's what he talks about in the first sentence. So watch the play on words of how God, he points out how God had blessed them. And then as a result of their disobedience, God absolutely does the reverse of it. So whereas God had multiplied her as the number of stars in the sky, reverse, now Israel would be reduced to a few in number. Whereas Israel had dwelt securely in the land, now she will lose her identity by being uprooted from the land and scattered among all nations. Israel had been permitted to serve the Lord, but now she will be compelled to serve idols. Once she lived in security, but now she would live in anxiety, despair, and in constant suspense for her life. To escape her misery, she will long for night and come and then for daytime. God had delivered her from bondage in Egypt, literal Egypt, but the people would now voluntarily return to that misery in such humiliated condition that no Egyptian would purchase them as slaves. That is what looking at scripture in context looks like. And it is far more believable than actually believing that this is speaking prophetically of 2,000 years later, way more than 2,000 years later of this going on during the transatlantic slave trade. But we're not done. We got more. Let's go. Now we're going to go to a source that they definitely do not like interacting with, and that is Dr. Eric Mason's book, Urban Apologetics, Restoring Black Dignity with the Gospel. If you do not have this, family, you absolutely need to pick this up, particularly if you engage with or have any family members that are engaging with Hebrew Israelites. In chapter 7 of this book, he talks about how bad the theology, the interpretation, and the exegesis that Hebrew Israelites use when talking about Deuteronomy 28 and 68. Let's check it out. So you can see here in the second highlighted portion, he talks about how Hebrew Israelites place great emphasis on the KJV of Deuteronomy 28 and 68, which describes what would happen to the Israelites who did not keep the law. So many Hebrew Israelites view this verse and chapter as a prophetic warning about what will happen if they don't keep the law. But as you can see, the KJV is not the best rendering of this. But if you take a closer look at what happens. So as we said before, Egypt is used figuratively in Revelations 11 and 8, which makes sense given the apocalyptic texts like Revelation abound in figurative language. However, Deuteronomy 28 contains little to no figurative language and should be taken at face value as a reference to Egypt. Again, if there is no other figurative language inside that particular chapter or verse, then there's no reason to assume that Egypt should be taken figuratively. It's funny now how the ships and everything else in verse 68 should be taken literally. The only thing that is taken figuratively is the place of Egypt. As you can see here, Dr. Mason in his chapter notes right in the first highlighted section, there are historical sources outside of Scripture that document a deportation of Israelites to Egypt. And he quotes from Flavius Josephus talking about the same thing that I talked about earlier. Not only that, there is another one from St. Jerome, which records a later event in which enslaved Israelites are transported to Egypt by ship, recounting the failed Simon Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 135. St. Jerome states, after the last overthrow of the Jews by Adrian, many thousands were sold, and what could not be sold were transported into Egypt and perished by shipwreck or famine, or were slaughtered by the people. And so you can see in the next part of the verse, the King James says, and there you shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen. But the NASB, ESV, and CSB are later and better versions or translations of the text from the original Hebrew. And they say, and there you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies. There you will sell yourselves. It's demonstrating that the Israelites are selling themselves. They are not being sold. So again, as he points out later on, so in this verse, the Israelites are not being sold. They are attempting to get enslaved, likely because they are indebted in some way. They will be so desperate and destitute that they'll voluntarily trade their freedom, selling themselves into slavery in order to obtain basic necessities. So again, they love to translate this part that says, and there no man shall buy you, and they love to translate that as no man shall redeem you. But as Dr. Mason points out here, the Hebrew word for translated buy refers to the acquisition of chattels or real estate and functions as the antonym of sell in the previous phrase. This passage does not use the Hebrew word translated or typically translated as redeem or buy back. So again, he's demonstrating there that the language of Hebrew doesn't fit their particular translation. And as we talked about earlier, in the end, he says this warning would strike the Israelites with tragic irony since they have just escaped slavery in Egypt. If they betray the Lord, their fate will be even worse than when they had never left Egypt in the first place. Close attention to the language and larger narrative of Deuteronomy simply confirms this passage has nothing to do with the transatlantic slave trade. So again, as this amazing commentary points out, what God is doing is undoing all the previous blessings that God had placed upon Israel. It is a reversal of things that had already happened. And again, because they had already went into Egypt and been delivered out of Egypt, God would be judging them for their disobedience by taking them back into Egypt. That only works if Egypt is literal, if not figurative. So again, we're not falling for the okie doke. We're not going for the Hebrew hopscotch. When you look at these verses in context, it is absolutely clear that the curses have already been fulfilled, and they have been literally fulfilled, that Egypt is speaking of a literal place, and that this is absolutely not speaking of the transatlantic slave trade. We will not insert ourselves into scripture that was not speaking of us. And again, Hebrew Israelites are the absolute worst at interpreting scripture. They're always trying to interpret it through the lens of to fit their own theology and not worried about the biblical context or the intent of the original author. So again, Deuteronomy 28 and 68 is not about black people. It is not about the transatlantic slave trade. If you have any other questions, let me know.